Welcome then everybody to WCT School London's webinar. This is on Discover Australian Shiraz with Emma Symington MW. My name is Lydia Harrison. I'm MW as well and an educator at WCT School London, and I also organise this programme of events. So we're very happy to welcome Emma back for the third in our series of Australian tastings. We've previously looked at Pinot Noir and Riesling, and if you missed those, you can watch those recordings back on our YouTube channel, so the WST Global channel, and then there's a school playlist with all our previous webinars. And equally, we'll be recording tonight, so if you need to duck away early or you missed something, you can watch it back. It will be up on our YouTube channel from tomorrow. And just to recap a little bit of housekeeping, so please use the chat if you would like to say hello. You have a separate function for Q&A, so any particular questions that you would like to put to Emma as we go through, please pop them in the Q&A and I will put them to her at the end of the session. You should be able to see Emma and her slides on your screen at the minute, but we can't see you. You won't see any other participants, so don't worry. And perfect. I think without further ado, then I shall hand over to Emma. So Emma, thank you very much, and introduce yourself and take it away.
Thanks so much, Lydia. And hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. So let's just move this on. Here we go. So this is me. I'm Emma Symington. So I work for Wine Australia, which is the global marketing and regulatory body for Australian wine. Obviously, our head office is actually out in Australia, based in Adelaide, but we do have a few regional offices around the world. And my office is based in London, and my office covers the entirety of the UK, Europe, Middle East, and Africa. So quite a big part of the world, but essentially what I do is predominantly talking to people in the UK and in Europe, and just getting people excited about Australian wines. So thank you so much, Lydia, for inviting me along tonight to talk to you all about Shiraz, which probably is my favourite topic to talk about, I'll have to be honest. So the plan for tonight, we're obviously talking about Shiraz, but I'm going to start off just giving you a brief overview across Australia, just to kind of set the scene. Now, I know any of you who did the Riesling session I did back in the summer, you might have seen some of these slides, so I'm not going to go into perhaps as much detail as I did then, but still just to set the scene. And then we'll dig straight into Shiraz, talking a bit about its history in Australia, talking a little bit about viticulture and vinification, but really the bulk of the session is talking about some of the key regions in Australia, and talking about the styles of Shiraz they make. Because one thing I often say, and for any of you who follow me on Twitter and Instagram might have seen I said this earlier, is that I believe there is no such thing as Australian Shiraz, which sounds a bit crazy when I'm doing a session talking to you about Australian Shiraz. But I think in the same way, we don't talk about French Pinot Noir and we don't talk about American Cabernet because you start talking about very specifics in terms of regions instead. I think it's the same with Australia because it is such a huge country and there's such a diversity of styles within Shiraz. And hopefully that's what you'll come away from with today. So to kick off, and again, for any of you who did the Riesling session or pretty much any session I've done elsewhere about Australian wine, you'll have seen this slide, but I love it and I include it in pretty much everything I do because I think it so clearly shows just how big Australia is. And that's so important when it comes to really understanding Australia's wines and the diversity of styles it makes. So as you can see, Australia is a vast country. It is obviously one country, but it's a continent-sized country. As you can see, it is bigger than Europe. So just to put some scale on this, if you flew from Perth over in Western Australia across to Sydney, that is a 5-hour flight. You'd be crossing 3 time zones. So it's about a 2,000-mile journey. So it's a similar journey to flying from London to Cairo. And if you took that flight from London to Cairo, how many countries you'd be crossing, how many different topographies you'd be crossing, how many different climates you'd be crossing, how many different wine regions you'd be crossing. It's a similar picture when you start to think about Australia. So always worth keeping in mind just how big Australia is, because it really does sort of begin to explain the diversity and styles of wines you're getting from Australia. So unsurprisingly, when you have such a vast country, there are a lot of wine regions in Australia. There are 65, as you can see here, and there's no quizzes, don't you worry. But actually, in terms of Shiraz, you've got 65 regions here, 60 of those plant Shiraz. So Shiraz is very, very important in Australia and grown in almost all of the regions across the country. But I think at this point, it's worth pointing out that although Australia is a huge country and it's got 65 different wine regions, it's actually not a huge producer in terms of wine, despite what you might think. So in terms of viticulture, in terms of plantings, there's about 146,000 hectares of vineyards across Australia. Now that might sound like a lot, but it's only about 4% of global plantings, or to put it another way, it's about the same as Bordeaux and Burgundy put together. So really not very much if you consider the size of France, let alone the size of Bordeaux and Burgundy put together and cover that across Australia. Not a huge amount of viticulture. Of course, Australia does really well is export. So about 2/3 of everything Australia produces in terms of wine is exported. And here in the UK, talking from a UK point of view, we are the #1 export market by volume for Australian wine. So something like 1 in every 5 bottles of wine sold in the UK off trade is Australian. So we see a huge amount of Australian wine over here. So I think there's often this perception that Australia produces a lot of wine, but it's not really true. As I said, it's only about 4% of global plantings. So coming to Shiraz. And Shiraz really is Australia's calling card, I suppose, a bit like, Malbec is Argentina's calling card, very similar. So it is, as I said, grown in 60 of those regions across Australia. As it says on here, 4 out of every 5 wineries produce Shiraz, and it accounts for about 30% of plantings, so just under 40,000 hectares of the vineyard in Australia is Shiraz. So very, very important to the country. It really has, I think, become synonymous with Australia. And just to point out, I'm sure you're all aware, but just to be clear, Shiraz is, of course, exactly the same grape as Syrah. It's just got a slightly different name in Australia. And no one quite knows why. There's a theory that perhaps some of those first cuttings that came across to Australia from France and from Cape Town were perhaps mislabeled, or whoever read the label then wrote it on the next label wrong, and so wrote it as Shiraz instead of Syrah. Other people think it's just that strong Aussie accent coming through. I'm not sure, but for whatever reason, it is known in Australia as Shiraz predominantly. Of course, there are a few exceptions to the rule. Some people are labeling it now as Syrah, but whatever, it is absolutely the same grape variety. So the history of Shiraz in Australia. So it's got a very long history. No one's sure exactly when the first the first cuttings of Shiraz came out to Australia, but it's in those early 1800s, so in those very early days of viticulture in Australia. And quite quickly, when those cuttings came across, people realised it was really well suited to the Australian climate, and particularly in those regions that were first planted. So in places like Barossa, in places like McLaren Vale, and places like Hunter Valley, suddenly this kind of warm, dry climate really suited Shiraz very, very well. So quite quickly, it found a really happy home in Australia. And, cuttings then spread across South Australia and Victoria, and also across to Western Australia and even down to Tasmania. And to this day, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get onto Barossa, but to this day, there's some incredibly old vineyards of Shiraz in Australia. In fact, the oldest vines in the world of Shiraz are in Australia in the Barossa Valley. They were planted in 1843. So it's got a very, very long history in Australia, and a long existing heritage of these really old vineyards that are still producing wine. So in those early days, so in the 1800s, the Shiraz was planted, as I said, and went really well, and people were producing table wine from it. But then around the early 1900s, there was a sort of a bit of a change domestically in Australia, and people moved away from drinking table wine towards drinking fortified wine. And I think, again, this is why Shiraz sort of has predominated in Australia, is because it really suited that change across to making fortified wines. So instead of making table wine from Shiraz, people started making fortified wines. So port style, mostly, for Shiraz in terms of fortified wines in the early 1900s. And then, of course, there was another change from about the 1950s. And this was actually driven by immigration from Europe after World War II. So quite a lot of people moved across to Australia after World War II, and they brought their kind of social mores with them in terms of drinking table wine, at dinner with food. And so then at that point, things changed again, away from fortified wine and back from table wine. So again, that Shiraz sort of changed back to making table wine. And by 1970s, as it says on here, it became the most popular wine in the country. Then, of course, what happens, the 1980s hits and the export boom happened. So this is when Australia really started sending out wine to the world. And particularly to the UK and USA, I think very quickly consumers got very excited about the style of wine that was coming out of Australia. And this was predominantly for Chardonnay in terms of white wines and for Shiraz in terms of red wines. Because at the time, if you remember, a lot of wine that was drunk at the time, particularly here in the UK, would have obviously come from Europe, but would have been regionally named. And a lot of it, let's be honest, was quite rustic. So instead, what came out from Australia were these varietally labelled wines, so labelled as Shiraz or Chardonnay, which were quite different. So really fruit forward, quite voluptuous, quite full-bodied and opulent, quite different to the style of wine that was produced in Europe at the time. And consumers here, and particularly in the States, got very, very excited about these wines, and this is what really started that export boom out of Australia. And then sort of end of the 90s into the 2000s, a guy who you might have heard of called Robert Parker came onto the scene, and he really caused quite a major effect in Australia, and in particular in some of the, I suppose, more classic warmer climate regions like Barossa, like McLaren Vale, because he started giving huge points, 98, 99, 100 points to really big blockbuster wines. So the sort of wines where the grapes were left for a long time, long hang time, so you're getting sort of 15.5 alcohol, but really rich, really concentrated, lots and lots of ripe fruits, but also aged in a lot of new oak. So this is the sort of wine he liked, and consumers therefore liked it because they liked, being able to buy these high Parker Point wines, and it sort of became a self-perpetuating cycle. So that's really what happened through the 2000s, these really big blockbuster styles of Shiraz. But of course, in the last 20 years, again, that's changed. And there's been a real move to, I think, not necessarily just in Shiraz, but actually across Australian wine in total, this real move to freshness and this hunt for balance. And I think that's actually been driven quite a lot domestically by consumers in Australia. Because if you remember, Australia is a hot country. And so, people are drinking wine and quite often drinking it outside with a lot of the lovely fish and produce and so on that you get in Australia. And what they really want to have with that kind of food is lighter styles of wine. And so there's been this real drive for freshness. And I think we're seeing that across all regions in Australia, not just the cool climate regions, but also in these, traditional warmer climate regions in places like Barossa. So there's been this move away from that kind of big blockbuster style. People are edging back in terms of oak, certainly not using anywhere near as much new oak as they used to, moving towards larger format oak and allowing that lovely fruit to show through. So that's kind of where we are in Shiraz these days. So just a quick overview of viticulture in terms of Shiraz. So Shiraz is a very vigorous vine. It does need careful pruning just to control that vigor, because otherwise you can get very high yields, which does sort of decrease quality. So that's one thing always to remember with Shiraz, but it is a highly adaptable vine. It can grow in a lot of different soils and in a lot of different climates. And I think, again, this is why it's done so well in Australia. It's been able to adapt to all sorts of different climates. Of course, as I said, it kind of started in those warmer climate traditional regions, but it is now grown across Australia, from hot regions to warm regions, even cold regions. So Tasmania, for example, which is particularly known for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, both in terms of still wine and sparkling, also makes some amazing Shiraz, or Syrah, as many people label it. So it is a great variety that can sort of adapt itself to a number of different climates. In terms of soils, in shallow soils, it doesn't do so well. It needs some irrigation, but in deeper soils, it really can be dry grown. It can root very deeply and find water. And being a Mediterranean variety, it doesn't need as much water as some others. So even in places like Barossa, for example, which is a warm climate region, they do have some deep soils there. So actually a lot of, particularly the older vineyards in Barossa, do tend to be dry grown and don't need irrigation, because these lines can root quite deeply. And then in terms of winemaking, I think Shiraz is quite an interesting variety for a winemaker, because there's all sorts of different techniques winemakers can choose to use to influence what resulting style of Shiraz they create. And I think a lot of these can also be driven by kind of consumer trends around the world. So things we're seeing quite a bit of lately are things like whole bunch fermentation or stem inclusion with Shiraz. I think particularly in some of the cooler climate regions, we're beginning to see, maybe only 10, 20% in terms of the whole wine. So just a little bit of whole bunch. But what it tends to give is a little bit more tannin. And I always find, particularly with whole bunch fermentation, you tend to get more aromatics, more kind of lifted aromatics, and perhaps a little bit more herbal. But in general, it accentuates freshness, that feeling of freshness in a wine. And coming back to what I was saying earlier about this sort of drive from consumers in Australia, I think this is partly why there has been this move by some winemakers to begin experimenting with more whole bunch fermentation in Shiraz. And so that, as you can see here, there's all sorts of things winemakers can do to experiment with Shiraz. Carbonic maceration to make a really easy drinking, early drinking style of Shiraz. Various people playing around with different sorts of wild fermentation to add complexity. Co-fermentation with Viognier. Now this is an interesting one, and perhaps we'll come back to when I'm talking about Canberra in a few minutes, because that's kind of where that really started. But essentially you're co-fermenting with a white grape variety, and traditionally Viognier from the northern Rhone, but it doesn't have to be Viognier. And you're co-fermenting really to fix the colour in the right wine. So you tend to get a deeper colour when you're using this technique, but you also tend to get more lifted aromatics. And I say it doesn't have to be Viognier, because I've certainly come across some Shiraz from Australia, which is co-fermented with Riesling, for example, instead of Viognier, but it has that same effect. And then, of course, winemakers can play around with how long they leave the Shiraz on the skins before they press it off. So the longer on the skins tends to sort of soften off those tannins. And then oak maturation. And again, this is where these sort of consumer trends globally are playing a part in what winemakers are choosing to do. As I said, back in the 2000s, the Robert Parker effect, winemakers very much were choosing to go for small barriques, quite a lot of new oak, so having quite a lot of oak influence in the wine. Whereas now many people are moving away from new oak and perhaps also to larger format oak, so things like hogsheads or puncheons or even big food. And then of course you've got the choice of type of oak. Many people are using French. American is very classic, particularly in the warmer regions, places like Barossa and Clare. People tend to be using American oak, but again are pulling back from that new oak, so using older format barrels. So all different sorts of things winemakers can choose to do to influence the Shiraz and the style of Shiraz they make. But of course, Shiraz obviously often is a varietal wine coming out of Australia, but it can be blended. So I suppose there's probably two really classic blends of Shiraz coming out of Australia. One being an SGM or a GSM, so Shiraz with Grenache and Mourvedre, so that classic kind of Southern Rhone blend. Again, Grenache and Mourvedre were grapes that were introduced quite early into Australia, and along with Shiraz did very well in some of these warm climate regions, partly as well because they were very well suited to making fortified wine in those sort of early 1900s times, but now quite often are blended together. And the other key blend, that Shiraz is a part of is what's known as the Great Australian Red. So that is Shiraz blended with Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, of course, in Bordeaux, Cabernet is blended with Merlot. And, what people often say is that Merlot fills that hole in Cabernet. So it adds that kind of juiciness to the structure of Cabernet. And Shiraz in Australia plays exactly the same role of Merlot. So again, it's adding that juiciness, that lovely fruitiness to the structure of Cabernet Sauvignon. So you have either Shiraz Cabernet blends or Cabernet Shiraz blends, which is a very classic and iconic Australian blend. So Shiraz Regions, and I have to say, I said this to Lydia earlier when we were just chatting, that pulling together this presentation was quite tricky, because when you've got 60 wine regions across Australia that produce Shiraz, and they're all making their own individual style of Shiraz, but I was very aware that we've only got an hour, so there was no way I was going to be able to cover everything I wanted. And this is really just a very small subsection of the regions I could be talking about. But given that we only have an hour, I've decided just to focus on 5 of the kind of key regions for Shiraz in Australia, covering the key states. So I have to say I have taken Tasmania out. As I said, they do make some amazing Shiraz in Tasmania, but it is very small in terms of production. So what we're going to cover now is starting with Barossa, because I think it probably is the best known region in Australia for Shiraz. And then we're going to talk about 2 regions actually in New South Wales, being the Hunter Valley and Canberra, to give, well, I suppose Hunter is that very historic region, and then Canberra is much more modern. In Victoria, I'm going to talk to you a bit about the Grampians region, being a relatively high altitude, slightly cooler climate style. And then across in Western Australia, we're going to finish up talking about Great Southern. So hopefully between those all, that will give you some idea of the diversity in terms of styles that Shiraz produced, but also in terms of the climates and topographies and so on across Australia. So we're going to start off talking about the Barossa, because I said it really is Australia's oldest and probably best known Shiraz region. Now, just to be clear, in case anyone's not aware, the Barossa is a zone, and it is comprised of the Barossa Valley and the Eden Valley. So as you can see here, the Barossa Valley and Eden Valley, they're both regions, they're both GIs, as it is in Australia, geographic indications, but they're next to each other, so they're contiguous, they share a border. Now, the Barossa Valley is the classic valley floor, so lower lying valley floor, very much a Mediterranean climate, hot, warm summers, cold winters, perfect, perfect place really for growing Shiraz. The Eden Valley, on the other hand, is not a valley, just to be confusing. It's actually an elevated plateau that sits sort of alongside but above the Barossa Valley. So higher in altitude, so it's cooler because of that. It's also much windier, so it really catches the wind, which again cools the temperature. So it's very much the cooler part or half of the Barossa. So the reason it's a zone, and the reason I say this, is quite often on a wine bottle, you'll just see the word Barossa and not Barossa Valley. And what that means is the winemaker kind of blended grapes together from the Barossa Valley and the Eden Valley in any proportion. So it might be 80% Barossa Valley, 20% Eden Valley, it might be 70-30, it might be 50-50. It's entirely up to the winemaker if it's labelled as Barossa. Now, of course, if it's labelled as Barossa Valley, this is when the 85% rule kicks in. So it's got to be 85% Barossa Valley floor fruit, and it can be 15% of something else, just like regions across Europe. So it's just slightly different with that zone being the Barossa. And the reason you have this zone, and the reason you quite often actually see it on wine labels, is because winemakers really like the ability to blend between these 2 regions. Because if you think you've got this Barossa Valley floor, which, as I said, is warmer, it's lower lying. So this is where you get that very classic Barossa Valley fruit from, that real generous fruit that's almost quite opulent, very rich, concentrated. The Eden Valley, on the other hand, still quite a bit of Shiraz grown there, but it's higher and cooler. So it tends to be more restrained, tends to be a bit more structured, so a bit more tannin, and it particularly has higher acidity. So by blending those 2 together, the winemakers often think they get a more complete wine or more complex wine. So this is why you quite often just see the word Barossa on a label. So anyway, so the Barossa is, as you can see, sort of northwest of Adelaide. It's like an hour and a half drive. And it was originally planted in 1842 and originally settled actually by Lutheran Germans. And so if you go there, and I don't know if anyone has been there, it's still very Germanic. It still has a real Germanic culture to this day. So a lot of the place names are Germanic, a lot of the family names, surnames are Germanic. Some people still speak German there, and there's also quite a real German influence, I think, to the food culture actually in Barossa. There's lots of sausages and cold meats and all that kind of thing. So it is a very historic wine region. Now this, and I've got this for some of the other regions we're going to talk about as well. So this is actually taken from our remote satellite imaging software. So all the dark green you can see on here is actually the vineyards. So this gives you a really good idea of, I suppose, how widely planted the regions are, and actually where the vineyards are within each region. So as you can see, the Barossa Valley itself is pretty widely planted. There's just over 9,000 hectares of vineyard in the Barossa Valley. So it is actually one of the bigger regions in Australia. The Eden Valley, on the other hand, as you can see, sits right alongside, much more sparsely planted. So there's far fewer plantings in the Eden Valley. It's about 2,000 hectares in comparison. This also picks out High Eden, which is a designated sub-region of the Eden Valley. And the clue's in the name here. It is the highest part of the Eden Valley, so getting up to about 550 meters. So very much the coolest part of the Eden Valley. And that's really where you get a lot of very high quality Riesling in particular grown. So just as a reminder, so the Barossa Valley itself, as I said, Mediterranean climate. Now the altitude, this is actually a little bit confusing because that's sort of the absolute maximum and minimum in the region. But in reality, the vast majority of vineyards are planted at about 250 to 300 meters in the Barossa Valley. So it is that, lower lying valley floor. The Eden Valley, on the other hand, still has a Mediterranean climate, so still quite warm in the daytime, though definitely cooler than the Barossa Valley, but very much cooler at night. And it does have this cooling influence of those breezes as well. And as you can see, much higher in altitude. And I think this picture just gives you quite a nice idea of that difference in altitude, because the vineyards you're seeing in front of you, that is the Barossa Valley floor, so the lower lying, very much Mediterranean climate. The tops of those hills, that's where the Eden Valley is. And I can tell you, if you do that drive up the hills, you can really feel the difference in temperature. You're pretty hot down in the Barossa Valley. You get out the top of the Eden Valley, you want to put another layer on. It is that much cooler and windier. So to just give you an idea of what that means in terms of grape growing, vintage is at least 3 weeks later in the Eden Valley as opposed to the Barossa Valley. So that is, the season is that much longer up in the Eden Valley, and because of that cooler climate. And this is just a picture up in the Eden Valley. So as I said, not a valley at all. It is an elevated plateau, but there's lots of different topographies, lots of different aspects. And as I said, much more sparsely planted. Now, the other thing that's certainly worth mentioning about the Barossa is their old vine charter, because globally it's a very special region in that they actually have this old vine charter. So they actually characterize their old vines, and they're all kept on a register. So this was set up back in 2009, and I think it's quite amazing, and I kind of wish the whole of Australia would adopt this, because I think it's so simple but so incredible to be able to put this on a bottle to share with consumers. So the way the charter works is, as you can see, very simple. So any vineyard that's 35 years or more old is classified as an old vine vineyard. Anything 70 years or more old is a survivor vine. Anything 100 years or more old is a centenarian vine. And anything 125 years or more old is an ancestor vine. And if you just start to think about the history some of these old vines have seen, I think it's quite incredible. So just to put some figures on here, just to put this into context a little bit. So I said earlier, Barossa, I think in total across Barossa Valley and Eden Valley has got about 11,000 hectares of vineyard. 2,500 of that is classified as old vines. So that's about 20% of the region. And 250 hectares is classified as centenarian vines or more. 250 hectares is more than 100 years old. I mean, it's just mind-boggling, really, and quite very, very special for the Barossa. As I said earlier, the oldest vineyard in the world of Shiraz is in the Barossa. That is Langmail's Freedom Vineyard, and that was planted in 1843. And the Barossa is very lucky because it's also got a number of very old vineyards, or the oldest vines in the world of other grape varieties too. So the oldest Granite is there in the Barossa, that was planted in 1850. The oldest Mourvedre is in the world is in the Barossa, that was planted in 1853. The oldest Cabernet Sauvignon is in the Barossa, and that was planted in 1888. So it still has this incredible repository of very old vines, which are obviously ungrafted, planted on their own rootstock. There's no phylloxera in South Australia. Just an incredible part of the world, really, to be able to go and visit all these old wine vineyards. So in terms of Shiraz, as I said, Barossa Valley particularly is that Mediterranean climate. So you do always get this generosity of fruit coming out of Barossa Shiraz, this kind of opulence, if you will, and power. But as I said, I think there has been a move away from, I suppose, the blockbuster style towards something a bit fresher. So many viticulturists are picking a little bit earlier than perhaps they did, just to retain a little bit of that balance. But you still always will have this rich core of Barossa fruit that is very, very specific to the region. Okay, for our second region, just check the time, I think we're doing okay. We're going to move across to New South Wales, to the Hunter Valley. So the Hunter is really one of the very historic regions in Australia. So I don't know if you all know of a guy called James Busby. He was a Scottish horticulturalist, actually. He moved out to Australia in 1820 and then became interested in viticulture. And then somehow he got the most amazing job in the world. He was sent back to France and Spain and spent 6 months traveling the wine regions of France and Spain, taking cuttings of different grapevines. And he ended up with cuttings of hundreds of different varieties. I think he had something like 600 different cuttings in total by the time he came back. They were all packaged up individually and brought back to Sydney with him. And at that point, they were divided into two. Half were planted in Sydney in what is now the Botanic Gardens. So if anyone's been to Sydney, you know where I mean. And the other half, James took up to his property called Kirkton Part, which was in the Hunter Valley. So this is why the Hunters really want to probably be most historic wine region in Australia. So he planted those cuttings at his property. The vines were propagated on, and then further cuttings were taken, and those were then sold and sent across Australia. And to this day, many viticulturists will sort of talk about having Busby cuttings in their vineyards or having Busby clones, because they can sort of trace that genetic heritage back to these original cuttings that James Busby brought out with him. So he was a really important person in, I suppose, Australian wine history, and was based, as I said, in the Hunter Valley. But I think the interesting thing about the Hunter Valley is if you looked at its vital stats on paper, it's really not where you choose to grow grapes, and certainly not where you think you'd be making amazing wine, because it's subtropical, it's hot, it's humid, and you get rain at vintage. So really not somewhere you'd think would be making amazing wine. But it's kind of a conundrum, the Hunter, because of these crazy climatic characteristics is the reason it makes some amazing wine. So as I said, it's hot, it's subtropical, but as you can sort of pick out from this map, it's on the Great Dividing Range. Now, the Great Dividing Range is a massive mountain range that runs right down the eastern seaboard of Australia. And pretty much all the wine regions are on the western side of the Great Dividing Range, because then they're in its rain shadow. So they don't get any of the weather systems that come down this eastern seaboard, because all the rain falls on the Great Dividing Range and they are in its rain shadow on the other side. The Hunter Valley, though, is on the wrong side of the Great Dividing Range. It's on the eastern side, which means it sort of gets all of these storms that come down this eastern seaboard, which is these late summer vintage rains I was talking about. But it also means the Great Dividing Range captures all the cloud cover. So although the Hunter Valley is hot, it's also very, very cloudy, which means it limits the amount of UV that can actually get through to the grapes. So although it's a hot region, actually it's got very slow ripening, which is fascinating, I think. And then because you get these late sort of summer vintage rains, actually the winemakers tend to pick quite early. So it's one of the earliest regions in Australia to start harvest, usually sort of January, February time. So because of that, the Shiraz, as we're talking about Shiraz, that is made always tends to be quite low in alcohol for Shiraz in Australia. So we're talking sort of 13%. as opposed to out in Barossa that I was just talking about, you're normally more like 14%. So lower in alcohol in the hunter because they're picking earlier, so the grapes aren't as ripe. And because of this very much cloud cover, the grapes aren't ripening so much on the vine. So you don't get this kind of generosity of fruit. In fact, you get a much more savory, restrained style of Shiraz that comes out of it, which is just fascinating, I think. So this is the hunter. It is quite a big region, as you can see, in terms of size. But as you can see, in terms of vineyard area, there's actually very little, and it's mostly around Pecolbin, as you can see, which is sort of pushed up against the Broken Back Ranges, so only just inland. So in terms of climate and altitude, as I said, it's subtropical. There's not really a lot to talk about in terms of altitude in the Hunter Valley, and certainly not enough to really give any kind of cooling influence. But I think this is quite a useful photo to show you, because I hope it shows you just what I've been talking about in terms of that cloud cover. And if you look at it, you know, this is not wispy cloud. This is quite thick grey cloud, and this is absolutely typical for what you see throughout the growing season in the hunter. So that's really moderating that UV, that sunlight intensity, which is why you have much slower ripening in the hunter than you might otherwise expect, you know, with the daytime temperatures, which are 35, 40 easily in the summer in the hunter. Now, the other thing that's worth pointing out in this photo, and a nice thing to remember for the hunter, is the soil, because there's two different soil types in the Hunter Valley. You tend to get whiter, lighter, paler, sandier soils, and then you get these, what you've got here, these darker, redder clay soils. And it's a really easy one to remember, because white grapes like Semillon are generally grown on those lighter, paler, sandier soils, and the red grapes like Shiraz are grown on those redder clay soils. So quite a nice one to remember there. So as I said, in terms of Shiraz for hunter, it does tend to be that much more savoury style, tends to be lower in alcohol, a bit brighter in terms of acidity. And I think it's always a great one to pull out if people only ever think of Australian Shiraz like Barossa Shiraz. This is a really good style to pull out and just to surprise people, because I think quite often it's not what people are expecting from Australia. And again, this is what I came back to at the beginning. There's no such thing as Australian Shiraz, because I think if you had this side by side with the Barossa, they are just two totally different styles of Shiraz, and a really nice comparison. And then the second region I wanted to talk about from New South Wales is Canberra district. So as I said, the Hunter Valley, very historic. Canberra, on the other hand, very modern. Okay, they did have some very early plantings back in the 1800s, but that was all ripped out in the early 20th century. And it wasn't until 1971 that really modern viticulture started. So it is a very modern region. Again, inland and up in the Great Dividing Range. But this is one of the regions which is on the right side of the Great Dividing Range, by which I mean the western side. So it's in the rain shadow, so it doesn't get affected by any of these summer storms. It's about, what, a 3-hour drive inland from Sydney. As it's been said to me, I have been to Canberra. I flew there because an Aussie told me it's the most boring drive in the world. Get on a plane. So I did. But I really enjoy going to the Canberra district. I think it's an interesting one. It's very small, actually, in terms of viticulture. There's only still about 250 hectares there, but it's really very quickly made a name for itself in terms of Shiraz. And that's partly down to a winery called Clonakilla. Now, I don't know if any of you know Clonakilla. It's quite famous these days, particularly for their Shiraz Viognier blend. So Clonakilla was started up in the 1970s by a research scientist, actually, who decided he was going to plant a vineyard. So he did. And then his son, Tim Kirk, was actually originally planning to be a priest, but got quite interested in, you know, the family winemaking. Then he went out to Côte Rôtie in, I think it was 1992, and tasted some classic Côte Rôtie that had been co-fermented with, you know, Syrah with Viognier, and got really excited about it, and realized that his dad on their vineyard had planted Viognier as well as Shiraz. So he went home and persuaded his dad to let him have a bit of a play, a bit of an experiment, and to do some co-fermentation of Shiraz and Viognier. So he's the first person in Australia that made this style. And very, very quickly, it found critical acclaim. Suddenly, everyone was just blown away by this wine. And it really is a modern cult classic now. And I think it's that wine that's really put Canberra district on the wine map in terms of Australia. So as I said, it's still a very much an emerging wine region. There's only 250 hectares, but it is particularly becoming known for its Shiraz. It is high altitude, so it's up in the Great Dividing Range. As I said, it's up to about 800 meters. So because of that, you've got the influence of elevation cooling the climate. Now, that's not to say it's a cold climate, because it's not. In the daytime in the summer, you're looking at 30, 35 degrees. But because of that influence of elevation, as soon as the sun sets, the temperature will plummet. So it's got a very big diurnal variation. So you might be 30, 35 degrees in the daytime. In the summer, you're probably dropping to 15, even 10 degrees at night. So a really big diurnal variation. And what that means in terms of grape ripening is the grapes are going to ripen really happily all day. But as soon as the sun sets and that temperature drops, it's going to stop ripening. So that keeps all that lovely freshness and acidity in the grapes. So this is a view across Canberra, and you can see it is very different to the Hunter Valley, particularly the sky. So here we have absolutely clear blue sky, and that is totally typical of Canberra pretty much all summer. Very, very high sunshine hours, very strong sun intensity. And because you're at high altitude, very high UV levels. So it's a little bit like in the Andes with Malbec. So you've got this very high UV levels. And what that does in terms of the grapes, in terms of ripening, is it really sort of fixes the color. So you always get a very deep color from Canberra Shiraz, lots and lots of flavor compounds. And it also really acts to, what's the word I want, soften the tannins. So you always get a lot of tannins in Canberra, but they're very, very soft because of the action of this UV. So that's absolutely classic of Canberra Shiraz, deep in colour, but very soft, really supple, luscious tannins. And personally, I always find a real lift in terms of aromatics from Canberra style Shiraz, that lovely kind of violet notes, which I really associate with this kind of high altitude vineyard area. So for our next region, we're in Victoria, the state of Victoria, and we've moved right down the other end of the Great Dividing Range, up to, down to a region called the Grampians. So this is really the foothills of the Great Dividing Range. But you've still obviously got some influence of elevation here. So nowhere near as much as Canberra, so certainly not as cool in terms of that diurnal variation as Canberra is. The Grampians is maybe up to about 400 meters, but still enough to have a cooling influence. But as you can see, you are much closer here to the ocean. So there is also a real maritime influence in the Grampians. And remembering the ocean that sits off the southern part of Australia is that very, very cold Southern Ocean. So you get all these very cold breezes that kind of push inland to help moderate that temperature too. So the Grampians again is a region that's not hugely planted, but it is very historic. It was originally planted in the sort of mid-1800s. And it again is a region that has got very old vineyards of Shiraz, I think, back to the 1860s, if I remember, 1817s perhaps, from Bess, who are based in this Great Western sort of sub-region of the Grampians. But the reason I wanted to include it is, if I push on one more, is this. And this is a granite outcrop, which is very specific to the Grampians. And if we remember from the Northern Rhone, Shiraz or Syrah has got a real affinity for granite. And it's an interesting one in Australia because, as I said, it's a huge country and it's very diverse in terms of its soil types and geologies. I mean, if you look at McLaren Vale has 40 different geologies, under 19 different soil types, hugely diverse. And it's similar across the whole of Australia. But what Australia doesn't have very much of, in fact, is granite. So the Grampians is really special because it has this real granite outcrop. And as I said, Shiraz and Granite have this real affinity. So unsurprisingly, the key grape variety planted in the Grampians is Shiraz. And the other interesting thing about the Grampians is actually the vineyard we're looking at here. This is Mount Lange-Shiraz. And back in 2007, the Australian Wine Research Institute, the AWRI, did some research actually based at this vineyard. Because at the time, a lot of people were talking about a particular character in Shiraz, but no one knew where that came from. And the character they were talking about was black pepper. And at the time, no one had any idea what this compound was in Shiraz. So the AWRI decided to research this, and they based their research at Mount Lange-Shiraz because it was a wine that was particularly well known for having this black pepper flavour. And what they discovered was a compound called rotundone. And rotundone, in fact, is exactly the same compound that is found in black pepper itself. So quite literally, when you're tasting black pepper in Shiraz, you are tasting black pepper. It's exactly the same compound. The other interesting thing they discovered about rotundone was that 1 in 5 people, so 20% of people, are anosmic to it. That means they can't smell it and they can't taste it. And I think this is absolutely fascinating. I mean, of course, everyone has different anosmias. You know, some people are much more able to taste and smell certain things or less good at other things. That's just how our genetic makeup works. But actually, to have a full 20% of people unable to smell or taste rotundone is very, very high. So, you know, in true wine geek style, I find that fascinating. So what they also discovered about rotundone is that the cooler sites of the vineyard produce more rotundone. So it really is, the black pepper flavour is something you get in cooler climates, Shiraz. So unsurprisingly, Grampian Shiraz is one of those styles coming out of Australia where you do tend to get this real black pepper note coming through. But they do also tend to be quite intense and concentrated in terms of, you know, black fruit flavour too, but with this cool climate, kind of spicy, peppery flavour coming through as well. And then the final region I wanted to just talk to you about is Great Southern. So Great Southern is across in Western Australia. So we've probably just flown about 1,500 miles across from the Grampians. So again, a huge distance, remembering how big Australia is across to Western Australia. The Great Southern is quite often referred to as one of the most isolated wine regions on the planet. It's about a 5-hour drive south of Perth. So you really have to want to go there. I have to say, I've never been. I'm longing to go to Great Southern. It's probably top of my bucket list of regions I haven't yet been to in Australia. As you can see, it is a really big region. It's about 150 kilometres wide by about 100 kilometres north to south. And because of that, it has been divided into 5 sub-regions, as you can see here. But again, looking at the satellite imaging, you can see there's not a huge amount of plantings in Great Southern. I think it's about 2,500 hectares across that vast distance. So not a hugely planted region. And it's an interesting one because of this huge size and because of the differences in terms of topography and particularly the maritime influence on the coast. These sub-regions are all very different to each other. So you've got Denmark and Albany right down on the coast. So very much maritime influence, very cool climate because you've got that cooling influence of the Southern Ocean. So those are 2 sub-regions in Great Southern that are particularly well known for Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. You then move inland a little bit up to Mount Barker and the Parongarups. You tend to get more Riesling there actually, so it's a little bit further inland, so a little bit warmer because of that. And then moving inland again, you come up to Franklin River, and this is really the sub-region that's particularly well known for Shiraz. So as you can see, it's further inland, so more continental in terms of climate, but it's also more elevated. You're up to about 400 meters again here in terms of elevation. So some cooling influence from elevation in the Franklin River. So this just sort of quickly shows those differences. As I said, Albany in Denmark, very much maritime, and moving more continental as you move inland. And this is just a view. This is actually Franklin Estate in the Franklin River sub-region. And as I said earlier, you can see it is very sparsely planted in terms of vineyards, and that you can see the vineyards just around the winery here, but then you can't really see anything else. It's all kind of open countryside, farmland, and lots of these big marri trees, which these huge eucalypts you get down in Great Southern. So in terms of Shiraz, Great Southern, as I said, is a cool climate region. So it does tend to be that kind of tauter, more restrained style of Shiraz. Quite different actually to the regions we've talked about already. I'd say much more cooler climate, a little bit more higher in acidity perhaps, and probably a bit more structured as well, a little bit sterner in terms of the tannin, and probably more red fruited. So I think that's really the 5 key regions I wanted to talk to you about. And I hope that really gave you a snapshot of what I said at the beginning, that there's no such thing as Australian Shiraz, because, you know, you go to Barossa, you have these big, rich, voluptuous styles, which you can kind of sink into. You know, then you're into Hunter, which you think is subtropical, but actually gives you these very restrained, medium-bodied styles. Then you're up into the Canberra district, which is high altitude, so deep in colour. But, you know, that lovely lifted aromatics that you get out of Canberra. Down to the Grampians, again, cool climate, but much more that kind of spicy, peppery style. And then right across here to Great Southern, which you've got probably a bit more structure and a bit more acidity going on. So all very, very, very different in terms of style. And certainly all wines, it's worth comparing back to back at some point if you ever get the chance. So I think that's just about everything I wanted to cover off in terms of Shiraz. But just before I pass back to Lydia, I thought it's worth pointing out our education resource website, which we set up a couple of years ago now. It's called Australianwidediscovercom. You have to register to use it, but once you've done that, everything is totally free to download and use as you see fit. So there's study guides in there. There's information about all the key regions and all the key varieties. There's information about sort of broader topics like old vines and sparkling wine. There's, as I said, the study guides, there's maps, there's video content. Kind of everything you would want to learn about Australia is here and free to use. So particularly for anyone studying pure exams, make a note of that, because I think it should be really your one-stop shop for everything to do with Australia. And with that, Lydia, I think I shall hand back to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Emma. If you just perhaps wanted to flip the slide on one more slide, because I'm just briefly going to mention we've got another Australian event coming up at WST School London, which is a virtual tasting. So it's still via Zoom, but it's a tasting. If you're based in the UK, we send out 4 half bottles of wine for the Little Fine Wine Company. The cost is per screen. So you can share that cost. You can share the wines if you want to with your housemates or friends or whatever. And that's in a couple of weeks. So the 11th of November at 7 p.m. But you need to book by the 1st of November so we have time to send the wines out for you. So if you're interested, again, you can find that on our website under tastings and events. So just if you're interested in Australian wine, I wanted to highlight that for you. And great. And so finally, I just thought we'll go through a couple of the questions that have come through in the Q&A for Emma. If anyone has any final questions, please pop them in the Q&A, but I'll just ask you a couple. So thank you, Emma. Was there, the first question was actually about fortified wines, and are they still producing fortified Shiraz in Shiraz? So if you had
actually there is a bit produced, nowhere near as much as there once was. Obviously, you know, people have now moved away from fortified wine and are predominantly making table wine, but there definitely is still some fortified Shiraz made in that what was called vintage port. Of course, they can't call that anymore. But yeah, you definitely do get fortified Shiraz. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. I know Darrenberg make one. And there's certainly some other people in Barossa and McLaren Vale who do the same as well.
Yeah, I think Seppeltsfield was mentioned.
Yeah,
and I remember tasting one at Penfields as well. I don't know if it was solely Shiraz, but there was definitely.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure theirs is Shiraz and Grenache. Yeah, they make more of a tawny style, yes, which is delicious. Yeah.
Brilliant. Another question that came when you were talking about the sort of revolution and different trends or sort of emergence in different styles of Shiraz. And the person asked, do you find that it's become difficult for older producers to move along with the times and adapt to the palate of the consumer? Or is it more along the lines of producers pushing a newer experimental style onto the consumer?
Good question. I would say a bit of both. I think the joy about Australia is because there's no real legal restrictions like there are in Europe. So producers are able to experiment more. And I think in general, Australians still have that kind of pioneering spirit to them. So they do all like to experiment and try new things. I think in general, they're not, stuck in their ways and doing the same thing year in, year out. There's also, the next generation coming through in terms of winemakers, people taking over from, older family members, which I think is also moving on in terms of styles. But it's not to say there's not those traditional sort of bigger styles of Shiraz made, because there definitely are. And there are, wineries which very much do that, and they revel in it and they do very, very well out of it. But I think there's just perhaps a broadening of different people trying to make Shiraz in different ways.
Brilliant. And yeah, as I agree with what you said about, you can't really just say Australian Shiraz anymore. There's so much variety. Great. You were talking about the age of vines, and that definitely captured some people's attention, particularly in South Australia. And we have a question about, is there a relationship between the age of the vine and the training system used?
Oh, good question. So I'm not actually sure in terms of Shiraz. I think, a lot of these vines, the original vines, would have been planted as for bush vines. Now, particularly in terms of Shiraz, many of them have been trained on a sort of a single wire. Grenache, though, on the other hand, there's a lot of very old vine Grenache in Australia, and a lot of that is still grown as bush vines. So, individual gobelot. But yeah, I'm trying to think of the old vine Shiraz I've seen when I've been out in Barossa. It is generally just on a sort of very simple single wire more than anything else, just to give a bit of support, but not a kind of full training system.
Brilliant. Just a couple more to go. Again, I think your comments about Rotundo really resonated with people. But they also then asked, well, what gives rise to the leathery, sweaty saddle aromas?
Well, that's a good one, because that is something that people used to talk about a while ago, particularly in Hunter Valley. The classic flavour was a leathery, sweaty saddle. But I think that predominantly was they had a bit of a Brett problem for a while in the Hunter, and certainly all the Hunter Shiraz I've tasted over the last few years, you don't get that at all. That, the sweatiness, I suppose, the leatheriness, I think absolutely that plays into that more restrained kind of savoury style. But I certainly don't see perhaps the level of Brett that you did once have. In any way, it's the other way.
Yeah, I always think of sweat as being more negative, and leather is
Exactly
probably more positive.
Yeah.
Brilliant. So final question. Oh, actually, it's a double. When and how did you develop a passion for Australian wine? And well, it's a little bit of a broad one. I'm not sure if you have a sort of short update, but it's about the situation with Chinese tariffs on Australian wine, if there's any local update on that. And sorry if that's a little bit off topic, that's fine.
The China one, to be honest, I don't think there is any update. That's just the way it is, sadly. Yeah, that's what it is with China. In terms of my passion for Australia, I mean, I've been working for Wine Australia for nearly 10 years now, which seems kind of crazy. It's gone very quickly. And before I moved to Wine Australia, I was in retail, working in retail in the UK for a very good independent in London, and tasted incredible wine from all over the world. But one of the ones that just stood out for me, I was very lucky. It's going to sound awful now, name dropping totally, but when you're able to try all the first growths and top Burgundy and the best Italian wines you can get your hands on and so on. But I tried Hill of Grace, and I think it was the 1982 vintage. Don't quote me on that, I might be wrong. But anyway, it absolutely blew me out the water. And at the time, I knew a bit about Australian wine, but nothing like I know now. And I just remember it kind of stopped me in my tracks. And for a wine to do that when I was exposed to so many incredible wines, really kind of made me sit up and listen. And then I got the job with Wine Australia, and I'm very lucky. I used to go, well, before COVID, I used to go out to Australia, every 18 months or so, and just going out there and being in the wine regions and talking to the winemakers. And let me tell you, the Aussies are the most incredible group of people in terms of winemakers. They're so open, so welcoming, so willing to share all their knowledge. And yeah, it just made me totally fall in love with the country and the people.
Thank you. I'm sure you've made a few people
Sorry, that was quite a long-winded answer.
Just the thought of being able to travel to Australia.
Oh, I know. Tell me about it.
But if we can't get there in person, you did mention earlier, but someone was also asking, will the Australia Day tasting happen in January in 2022 in London? I'm not sure.
We are hoping so. That is very much the plan. You know, I feel like at the minute in life, you can't plan too far ahead because who knows what's going to happen. But absolutely, all things being well, it will happen in January.
And is there a place that's best for people to find out about that? Or
good question. At the minute, we're still talking to wineries and signing people up and that kind of stuff. As soon as we're ready to announce it, we will via our newsletter or go on the WSTA Trade Diary website, all the usual places you hear about our events. It will be announced.
Brilliant. Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Emma, for another incredibly informative and exciting look at Australia. I think it's so good to sort of look at some of the classic regions like Barossa, but also some that, so much lesser known, like Franklin River. So it's just a shame we don't have 3 hours and we can talk about all of the 60 regions.
And the wines to taste alongside, hey?
Exactly. Oh, we'll be here all day. But thank you so much. There's lots of people thank you in your chat for your brilliant presentation. Thank you from myself and the WST School London for sharing that with us. And yes, the recording will be up live tomorrow.
Great. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.